All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is Melissa with the Fully Mindful. I'm here with, I'm going to totally butcher her name because we just went through this. So I'll have her correct me, but I'm here with the lovely, the amazing, the talented, the beautiful, the wise Sarasvati Hewitt. Now, correct the way that I just said it.
So technically Sarasvati, like the N like a the. Also like in Bali, it's more like a W sound. In India, more like a V.
Yes. So my
Yeah.
apologies. My Western mouth just doesn't quite go there. So but I am so glad to have you here. And,
Thank you.
most recently you've become one of my yoga teachers, which was kind of coincidental and accidental, but a wonderful surprise. And I had already reached out to you to be on the podcast, and I was like, oh, but wait, I should take her class. So I've been doing that, and it's been lovely. So thank you for being an incredible teacher.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
and the class that I'm talking about for the listeners, I mean, I'm sure you teach all kinds of yoga classes, but the class that I've been taking, and I think that I'm really interested in talking with you about today, is this style of yoga called Yin. So how long have you been teaching Yin?
Okay, so let's see. I've been teaching yoga for 19 years, but I think I've been teaching yin for about, I think 10. I was trying to figure this out because I was going back and remembering, and yeah, I think it's actually been about 10 years.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and the way that I got into yin is sort of funny. I was just telling my students yesterday that it was very much a matter of like right place, right time. Because even though I had already trained as a Hatha teacher, I was living in Ashland, Oregon, and I was working in a coffee shop and I had just started teaching classes because I had pretty recently become a trained and certified Hatha teacher. And there was this guy that would come to the coffee shop named Matthew Schulman, and he was becoming a massage practitioner. And so he had heard that I used to be a dancer and a ballerina. So he wanted to like look at different body types and would I want a free massage? And I was like, oh yeah, I want a free massage, right? Because
Right.
I had so many injuries from yoga. So he actually ended up repairing like the scar tissue on my hamstrings, like injuries from dance. And at the time, he was telling me about, because I was like, oh, I became a yoga teacher. And he said, oh, I do yoga. It's this style from China, and he said we do it with our martial arts. And he was kind of telling me about what he did. And I didn't really understand. He was talking like about fascia and glial cells and stuff that at the time just meant nothing to me. So what's interesting is that I ended up co-owning a studio at one point years ago here in Portland, and I was teaching Hatha primarily, maybe a little Vinyasa, but people were asking for this style called Yin, and I remember being like, "Isn't that what Shulman used to teach?" Or like, "Isn't that what Shulman was talking about?" And so I reached out to him and I was like, "Hey, where do you live?" And he told me that he was living still down in Ashland, but he would come up sometimes to Portland. And I said, "Well, if you're ever up here, maybe you can teach a little to my students or whatever." And basically, one night he missed a bus, or a bus was late or something, and he couldn't make it to teach. And so he called me and he said, "You're going to teach yin yoga." And I was like, "Well, I don't know how." And he said, "I'm going to tell you exactly what shape to put them in, and you're going to keep them there." And I was like, "Okay." And I was trained, with like Sanskrit words and like, very different style than yin. So he was like saying things like dragonfly, like all this stuff. And I was like, what are we talking about? Like, I don't know. And he's like, "Oh yeah, this, and, Paschimottanasana, right? It's not, caterpillar." Like I didn't know what he was talking about. So I did my best. I played my style music and kind of like talked a little because I didn't really know what I was doing. And people loved it. And
Yeah.
I was like, what is the deal with this style? So, because I needed to understand more about it, I basically started practicing on my own because I found this video by a really cool guy, Travis Elliott, really cool guy down in LA. Travis had this free video on YouTube. So, basically, doing an experiment on myself, I did the exact same practice every single day for 750 days in a row. on like an experiment on myself to like see what would happen, because I started teaching more of this and people were just loving it. And it wasn't just that like it was odd because people were not just experiencing something with a deep flexibility. We had people coming to us and being like, this is helping my insomnia and this is helping, my anxiety and all these things, these issues with my gut. And like they were telling us all this stuff and people were like, how does it work? And we were like, we don't really know. And because I already had a kind of background, like I started studying anatomy around 16. And so I had a kind of more medical background. And then I realized that I would need to go deeper into like neuroscience. So I ended up actually taking courses at Portland State University on interpersonal neurobiology, looking through this lens of like mental health and yoga and starting to piece more together because people were just like, yin is changing our lives. And we were like, we don't know how.
Yeah, and before we get into that, because I do want to get into that, just so the listeners, there might be some folks out there who are like, okay, she said yoga slower, maybe holding longer. So maybe get us all on the same page of what a practice of yin looks like.
Okay, so before I do that, if it's okay, I want to tell you about the lineage because I think it's important
Sure.
to understand the reason. Also, it's very important that I honor, these teachers and these people that carried this for so long, when really it was like not just intended for like white moms like me in America to do, because honestly, these were traditions of families and secrets of China and India. So the way that this all, begins, also technically, I've been talking a lot about history of Kung Fu. So basically, yoga and martial arts begin in India, and there's this huge sweep across with Buddhism. So then you see like karate, jujitsu, which have origins that we see, like we think Brazil, but it's actually through Japan and stuff. So everything really originates from India, and we have these movements of different aspects. So yin is the stretching from the Kung Fu, Tai Chi Pekwar monkey style Kung Fu. And really, yin is just the stretching. It's like one piece of this greater aspect. So for a long time, for I believe around 9 generations, the only way we would have ever learned this style would have been from learning from a certain family in China. And a lot of this stuff really kind of originated from a place called Shaolin Temple, and then it kind of dispersed throughout. So monkey style specifically was a certain family, and there were 3 young brothers. The youngest brother basically was like, I don't want to do this. He moved to LA. And then I mentioned, right, the right place, right time. So I feel like we talk about this how for me, for Shulman, for Paul Greeley, for Polly Zink, we were all in the right place at the right time. So this young brother was in LA, and Polly Zink, who is like the head of Yin, really, he's the only person that was ever taught Yin in America. Polly Zink was doing what's called Eagle style. So he was doing Eagle style. And this young brother from China was like, this guy's body is perfect. His skeleton is perfect for monkey style kung fu. So he approaches Polly Zink and he says, I want to train you, which is really cool because this guy was kind of like over it before, but he decides he's like, you know what? I want to get back into this because look at this guy's perfect. So he trains Polly Zink, and that year Polly Zink wins Kung Fu Champion of America. And people are like, where's this guy coming from? Like, he's so good. So it's amazing because it starts as yin is just the stretching along with things like animal and alchemy medicine, meditation, kung fu stances, and weapons training. So yin's just the stretching. So here's what happens. This is so funny. So Paul Greeley, who actually is now the person that is the most famous for, we associate Paul Greeley probably more with yin than anyone. Um, Paul Greeley is a jujitsu master. Also, his wife is the first woman to ever give belts in jujitsu. They're amazing. Um, but he saw these infomercials like way back, like maybe in the 80s or 90s. And you would see these crazy infomercials with Polly Zink, who's doing this wild monkey stuff. And he's just like a pretzel flexible. Like I'll tell your crew, type in Polly Zink, and you're gonna be like, what the contortionism is happening? It is phenomenal. And you can see immediately why this guy saw him and was like, look at that skeletal variation. He's going to be able to do everything. So Paul Greeley thinks, I'm a great martial artist and I've done all this yoga. I'm going to go study with this guy. And then I will also be able to do what he does. But here's what happens. After a year of working his butt off, he starts to be like, I don't know why, but he's also watching other bodies and he's like, this is not just about muscle and effort. Something else is happening. And he begins to understand and develop skeletal variation, understanding that the bones primarily are what allow us to do or not do a shape. So Greeley, who I believe studied at UCLA, I think, was then also doing like bone bank, Montana kind of style stuff and comparing bones. That's another thing that your listeners can check out very easily. Paul Greeley has his photos up for the public under bone photos, so you can really clearly see skeletal variation. So then he ends up teaching not only yin, really at first, Greeley only taught yin in other things he was teaching. And one day he was doing it on his own between teaching like Bikram classes or something. This was at Yoga Tree in San Francisco. And Sarah Powers, who's a very famous yoga teacher, she goes, Greeley, what you doing on the floor? You know, he's doing all these weird stretches. And he goes, oh, I'm doing this like kung fu stretching. And she goes, it looks like you pulled out all the yang and left the yin. And that's how we got yin yoga. So
Mm-hmm.
then Schulman never actually intended to even practice yin. It was more jujitsu. So we all just happened to be right place, right time. And honestly, everything just sort of like came to this point where all of us were in this point where we started to know a lot about these different pieces of anatomy and neuropsychology. And it all sort of came to this point where we figured out more and more about it. So for years, Schulman and I, did trainings and stuff. And what we started to realize is that, with this basic stretching, which is just the most basic stretching, it is a type of container. So, for example, if I'm seated and I take my legs out, we call that dragonfly. My, target is things like the inner leg and the hamstrings in the back. It's going to look totally different for everybody, right? In yin, we're not trying to make it look a certain way. We're just trying to find a stretch in the fascia. And we do so by not staying there for 5 seconds, right? Or a minute, but more like 5 minutes or 10 minutes in some of the classes. So we're taking these very classic Kung Fu style stretches on the ground and we're holding them between 3 and 10 minutes.
Yeah, and something kind of really magical I've found happens. Now, I wouldn't have told you that the first time. I remember the first time I heard about yin. I mean, honestly, I was like, what the fuck? Why would anyone do this? You're just like on the ground. Like, this looks so boring. And
No,
like, I'm
totally.
all,
Yeah.
CrossFit and like class yoga and power yoga and all that stuff. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. They're all wonderful. This is just something really different. And it wasn't until, I grew a little bit, maybe matured a little bit, that I was like, okay, I'm going to try this thing. And the one thing that I will say, for those of you who haven't tried it, is it is not easy. So that was the mistake that I had was, oh, you're just staying there in this really long pose. You might have a bolster, so you have a pillow, like you're just sleeping. And holy guacamole, that is not what is happening in the body at all. And there's this
Yeah.
whole other component of your mind and your spirit getting very involved in this. So can you speak a little bit about that aspect? Like what is happening when you're starting to hold these postures,
Uh,
not just
oh
physically,
my gosh.
but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, when you're holding these postures for 5 or 10 minutes?
So this is the thing we have to first understand is, of course, the experience is different for everyone. But for most Westerners with zero meditation training, sitting in these shapes is so intense because it's not only incredibly physically intense, but you begin to see everything about the mind
Mhm.
because you're not just like about to move to the next shape and then the next thing, you're just there and then you're there and you're still there. So you're sitting with the self. And this is, meditation is the root of all of the practices, right? It always comes back to meditation, which is very easy for us to see with data, its benefits. But the truth is, meditation is hard.
Mhm.
And to get people to sit for even 5 minutes is hard. So the thing about yin is that yin is not only a cognitive behavioral therapy and a prep for seated meditation, prepping body and mind, but along the way, it is a form of Taoist meditation. So here's what starts to happen. In the tissues, for example, in the first 90 seconds, we primarily feel the muscle. And then around 3 minutes, we really get into the fascia and the connective tissue. What makes them different from the muscle is that muscle gets more blood flow, opens very quickly, right? And it recoils pretty quickly. Tissues like fascia, connective tissue, very different function, not the same blood flow, right? They're going to be a different style of more like realigning themselves properly. They don't have the same kind of rebound effect. So, very different tissue types. And when we do our muscle work, things like CrossFit, running, all that, which is awesome for the body and everything has its place, but that's going to work the muscle, which is different than when we do yin and we get into the fascia connective tissue. Also, the thing about it, like it took me a really long time to understand exactly what it was about yin that was making it so different. So there's a couple things. One, I think a lot of it really it comes back to sleep. And I lecture a lot about neurobiology of sleep. So I have to mention that I think a lot of it really has to do with yin is like the first domino that sets off this beautiful domino effect of health. And for a long time, we were like seeing these pieces and trying to figure out like where did things begin. And I was like, well, yin is the beginning because part of it is that yin is boring. And because yin is boring, it actually helps as a pre-cleanser for the brain and it helps remove insomnia, which I mean, that in itself is huge. Like understanding it. That one took me a while to figure out because for quite a few years, we talked about this triangle where we talk about in the middle sits yin. And the 3 points of the triangle are sleep, gut digestive, and mental health.
Mhm.
And I actually mostly started focusing on mental health. And then a student came into me and said, you're going to freak out when you read this book called Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. And so I took some time off teaching to read and memorize the content. And when I read that, one of the things it took me a while to figure out, but when they got to the stuff about insomnia, he was like, insomnia happens when you don't have enough time to process. And it's a big problem because of our technology being super good times. And I thought, oh my God, that's it. I mean, yin is so boring,
Mm.
but the boredom creates space and you can process and daydream. That's also very important because I don't teach my team to teach like you're teaching Zen Buddhism. I'm like, let them daydream,
Mhm.
let them think it out. We'll get to that point where we do that meditation and you might find that the brain moves into these very, very like Zen spaces, but don't force it. Don't force it at all. In fact, really let people like work it out. And some days the brain will ruminate, right? Some days we're going to be going over stuff. Some days the mind's fairly clear, but you create a container and then you can start to cleanse the mind. So it starts with removing insomnia, and then the bigger piece is that when we can sleep better, then we can dream better. And when we dream, we process emotion. And so a huge part of yin is how it fucking connects, sorry, connects
Yeah.
with like
Oh.
the dreams. And like this is the part that it just blew my mind when I started to realize I was like, this is so phenomenal that this very classic stretching, which is just the most basic martial arts stretching, if done in a certain way, can help so many things. And it's just so basic, it's like almost hard to wrap our brain around.
Well, what I found fascinating, I was in your class, I think just the other night, and something happened, and I was like, after I noticed what it was, and it's what I've experienced. I do breath work. I do kind of conscious connected breath work, so kind of like a holotropic style of breath work, which can definitely cause what's called transient hypofrontality, right? Where, part of the prefrontal cortex kind of shuts down a little bit. The ego goes to the back of the room and there's space, right? It's also what you get in a runner's high. It's all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And the last place I would have expected to experience that is in a yin yoga class. But that's what happened. And I was
Yeah.
like, I don't remember how or why. And I mean, part of it is when you experience this, you lose sense of time. That's the beautiful thing, right? It's exactly
Yeah.
what you're talking about. Like the brain, the mind, the body, the spirit all has space in a way that
Yeah.
we definitely don't normally as humans, especially in the way that we live our lives today and the way society is. And I thought, that's fascinating. So I was
Mm-hmm.
curious, like, have you heard people talk about this experience of kind of being in a like a lucid, maybe dreamlike state during some parts of their yin practice?
Absolutely. And I think what a lot of times what's happening, especially when we have, okay, so a lot of what I do is I look at modern neurobiology, but then also like really ancient text. And a lot of times I'll see interesting crossover. So when I was at PSU studying some section on neurobiology, they mentioned actually we were looking at mindfulness stuff because
Mm,
they were talking about a certain study and they were like, yeah, we could see in MRI scans, and they were actually looking at monks' brains, and they said you can see where the brain will move like from a seeking circuit to
mhm,
an avoiding circuit. And they were like, but the movement is like very slow with the monks, or sometimes it disappears. And I was thinking about that and I was like, that's fucking raga and devesha. And in the
mhm,
klesha, we have what are called the five klesha. I was like, that is raga and devesha, because raga, right, attraction, and devesha, aversion. I was like, that is exactly what they describe. But here's the thing: if you sit and meditate, it would, if you're paying close enough attention, it's going to become very obvious that your brain's like, oh, I want to go eat. Oh, I don't want to do this. Oh, and you're going to start to be like, oh, my brain is literally going from I want this, I'm avoiding this,
mm,
which is because we want to maintain homeostasis. So the moment we start seeing that in any form, right, that's part of our observation of thoughts. But what's wild is that forever yoga's been like, do yoga and use these techniques, and you can slow that process, and at times it will stop.
mhm,
And now you can see it in an MRI scan. But what starts to happen is that, yeah, we're actually experiencing like changes in brain waves, and then we're in these spaces that are they're meditative, and there's all these different spaces we can be in. But sometimes it's like we're getting that really zen clarity, and sometimes it's dreamlike. But it's interesting because we start to see that by calming the body, right, you can really quickly come into these spaces. And I was talking this week, right? You do a lot of breath work. You can change what's happening in the body, you can change what's happening in the breath, and things start to shift in the nervous system. And that's so much of what we're doing with yin, is we're not just changing the fascia, but what we're doing is changing really the nervous system and even the relationship with it.
yeah, and I see that, and the more I practice, whether it's yin or breath work or some combination thereof, it's not just in the moment of the class. I mean, these are, like you said, they become more permanent changes in your nervous system.
Yeah.
Not you sleep better, digestion is improved, we're calmer, there's more space between what I might react to. I have an opportunity to respond rather than to react. All
Yeah.
by what seems to be from outer appearances a really boring, you know,
Totally.
stretching practice.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's just like the most boring. It's like it's unbelievable. Like it just still blows my mind, and it works so well. And part of it, like I actually talked recently about this as well, how because I was actually looking at Huberman, who's at Stanford. He was talking about some stuff around neurobiology of grief, and looking at how people who had vagal toning practices were way less likely to experience complicated grief. Well, here's
Mhm.
why that matters in yoga. I'm like, look, when we do yoga, you're not only practicing for the moment, you're not only practicing for right then and the next 24, 72 hours, but you're actually healing things from the past. And I'm not just talking about ripping scar tissue off that knee. but working through mental health stuff, working through things from the past, but also it's making you more resilient for the future. I'm like, that seems pretty fucking awesome when we do
Yes.
an hour of this basic stretching and you're literally like you're going into all these different ways of healing the self, literally past, present, and future.
Yeah, and maybe even future generations. I don't know if you've seen those studies on intergenerational
Mm,
trauma. I'm thinking of the one, I can't remember the name of the study, but it's the one with the mice. And, unfortunately, they kind of torture these poor little mice by shocking them anytime they're close to the scent of cherry blossom tree, something that they might be
mm,
close to in the wild. And obviously, it causes this trauma response within them.
mhm.
And to the point where, if they just come close to the cherry blossom, the scent of cherry blossom, they have the same trauma response. And then they
Yeah,
studied, because mice don't live very long and they also reproduce really quickly. They looked at, and for 14 generations, anytime
right.
they
The
scent that cherry
epigenetics.
blossom, yeah,
Yeah,
it's epigenetics. And
totally.
so, we have this opportunity with yin, like you said, not just to heal our own past, present, and future, but even have an impact on generations to come. I mean, that's wild,
Totally.
right?
It's
Um,
phenomenal. And it's phenomenal that some people are practicing not only for themselves, right? That things are passed through the genes. I also think it's helpful because when we start thinking in that very like scientific yoga way, we can start to be like, oh, well, I
mhm,
can see why. Like, for example, if your ancestor mistakes a stick for a snake, that can code in their brain and that can affect, how our family feels about snakes, right? Depending on these things. But we have to remember our system thinks that it's protecting us, and
mhm.
then it can end up causing, so much stress in the system. So even by understanding more about the function of the body, that allows us to have such a different awareness and or possibly control of the nervous system, which in tandem we're already doing, right, by practicing yin. So it's like you start to understand more about, why does the body function this way, and understanding things like epigenetics and environment, right, and all these different components. And then I think it can be really helpful in people's journeys to understand how things come to be the way they are.
Yeah, and I guess I want to get your take too. I mean, you alluded to it a little bit of like, we're coming, it's really important to recognize the history and where yin and other yoga comes from. And, it's been pretty whitewashed in this country. I mean, I'm glad that yoga is everywhere and available. And
Yeah.
yet, there's a little bit of this danger. Here you and I are, fairly dominant culture here, and we get to access this. I mean, what's your sense of that, and what, if anything, can we do to remedy, any whitewashing that has already happened?
Well, the first thing that I do is I literally end every class by saying the same thing. I tell people, remember, it is an honor and privilege to practice yoga and
Mhm.
meditation. Remember that for thousands of years, these were secrets of families in places like India and China. So I have people recognize that, so we're constantly, constantly remembering it. I also really encourage people to take classes from people who are from like Asia, Southeast Asia.
Mhm.
In my training, for example, I do a 100 hour. One of the first sections that we teach is actually something that's taught by Susanna Barkataki, who is a brilliant woman who I believe grew up in India and maybe England. And she's been, I think, I don't know, practicing yoga probably 40 or 50 years or something. And she teaches sections on cultural appropriation. And
Mhm.
she has a really beautiful way of explaining things and can answer a lot of questions about history of yoga. Um, but I think a lot of it is just to be open to learning and to be, realizing that it's really cool for us to have this and to look at ways that we can support not only teachers from these places, but the places themselves. Like one of the things that I really want to work on is we're not really supposed to even teach yin in America. So I'm always like the punk rock one, and I'm like, yo, we should basically be going to China and find this family, and every yin studio should be fucking paying them because we
Mhm.
really don't have, it's like, I mean, I don't know. I get beef sometimes with how people do stuff because I'm like, remember, people had to carry these traditions when it wasn't cool and it wasn't easy. And just because we decided it was cool or whatever, and
Yeah.
like it doesn't mean that like it belongs to us, and yoga is very strong and for thousands of years has existed, this beautiful tiny four-letter word. It can mean so many things, but it stays strong. But I think it's just we're at a point where we can see that, like, especially even with yin getting popular, we are ready for more of the deeper roots of yoga. And
Hmm.
like when I was in India, this was probably 17 years ago. I remember I was in Rishikesh, which is like beautiful yoga city of the world, right? We have one of those. That's cool. So I was at the yoga city of the world, and I would go down to the Ganges and I would talk with people. And I'm like 23 and I'm like, I teach yoga in America, right? Like I'm just like such a dork. And everyone was so cool. They were all like, awesome. We love that you love yoga. And they were all just kind of the same. They were like, look, we've had yoga for a long time. And we're going to keep telling you the same shit, which is that you should just meditate and chill, and you're gonna keep doing Ashtanga until you work that shit out. And like it was kind of funny because they were
Mm.
all saying the same thing. They were like, burn through this physical obsession with the asana, and then you will understand more about yoga. So it's very
Yeah.
exciting that we have this sweep now from Vinyasa, Ashtanga, Bikram style, stuff like that. And we've really got this big wave of yin, which it's very needed. Our nervous systems really need it. But what's really cool about it, here's what's even more exciting, is that by swinging into yin, we teach yin in such a certain way where it's always about harmony. And that's part of what really sold me on yin. When I went to yin, and at one point, like overstretched my glutes, Paul Greeley was like, don't do pigeon or swan anymore. Go back to the gym and start doing squats. And I was like, the head
What?
of Yin just sent me to the gym. I was like, what? I was like, I love these guys. I was like, I'm so sold because they're martial artists and they're not like, you should only do this one thing. They're like, that's crazy. Pro
Mhm.
athletes cross train for a reason. So what's great about Yin is that Yin is going to give us a better foundation in general to be like on and off of our mat. Why do we do what we do? Because the Taoist principle is harmony. So if it's not bringing you harmony, you got to question why you do it. And it's a really great way to live, right? It's a great
Yeah.
principle because if you start, we joke that you go yin side and you never go back. Because once you go yin side and you go, wait, do I even need this stretch? Or, do I need to put more strengthening here? Or is this side different than this, right? When we start going yin side, we have this awareness. When we're in our lives, when we're in our jobs, our relationship, we start to be like, wait, how does this feel? Does this work? Did this used to work? What's
Mhm.
really happening here? And we start to view things in a different way.
I love that. And I think that's definitely my attraction to yin because, my first introduction to yoga was Bikram and then Ashtanga. And there's
Yeah.
very much right way to do it. And there is one way to do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what your body, it doesn't matter. I mean, there are teachers who are more flexible, but in terms of their teaching, but generally speaking, there's a right way to do it. And I've been in classes where, the teacher is doing their job and I mean, no judgment on them, but they are correcting me in a way that is harmful to my body. And
Yeah.
what I love about yin is it's a little bit more, you're definitely more present. There's no right way. And I used to be consumed also with, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And what I love about yin is it's what's right for me in
Oh
this moment
yeah.
with
Oh
this
my God. I
body.
mean, this is like, so this is the kind of stuff that like it took me time to realize that yin was helping so many people and for so many different reasons. Because let's say,
Mhm.
for example, we're in eating disorder recovery, like many of us are, and you go to yin, it's like it doesn't matter what it looks like. You can't try to make it look like what's happening with
Mhm.
the person next to you. You can't even try to make it look like what you did a year ago because with yin, it's all about the moment. Also, you could just lay in shavasana the whole time, get an A plus. You have to listen to your own body. It requires you to get to know your own body because the teacher cannot possibly know. And I never adjust my students, right? It's like we know that the individual is going to get to know their body. So people, they start to develop this confidence because they're getting to know their body and they're not concerned about the external because what it looks like means nothing in yin. And again, that principle, right, starts to shift things because in so much of what we do, what it looks like means everything. And Yin's
Mhm.
like, I don't give a fuck what it looks like.
Right.
Where's your knee go? Like that's the joke. Really goes, where's your knee go? I don't know. Where's your foot go? I don't know. And that's the greatest thing ever. So we all get to navigate, and along the way, it's like, yeah, people get to know their body and experience this very real, like love and compassion for the self,
Mhm.
while also figuring out what we actually need and don't need. And like, honestly, we have to understand that the roots of these practices were generally for young dudes that were contortionists. I shatter yoga dreams all day long in Portland, Oregon. All day long. These kids are like, I want to do this. And I'm like, let me take a look at your shoulder, your back. I'm like, that's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm like, your bones won't do that. Why would we ruin our body
Right.
doing a shape that doesn't work when really the physical part means so little? Because that's the thing, too. When we start doing yin, we realize there is so much more beyond the shapes, which we all know and we've all been taught. But I think that we often don't get to that part because if you sit and meditate and you haven't prepped the body or the mind, it's going to be pretty hard to get there. But yin is like the smoothest, dopest way for most of us to not only figure out how to sit and meditate, but along the way, you're doing it too.
Yeah. I think, I was just sitting there thinking while you were talking, I was like, I think that's why I was so unnerved by yin when I first saw it. Because I was like, I don't know how to be with where I'm at right now. I
Yeah.
want to be, I craved somebody to tell me the right way and the wrong way to do things because I didn't trust my body. And I know that comes from years, my own story is years of eating disorder, alcoholism, ADHD, just shoving that shit away. And so it
Hmm.
was terrifying in a way to
Totally.
say, okay, I'm going to sit here with where I am, and that's okay. But the second I gave myself permission to do that, and have been with teachers like yourself or others who really understand that, it's so liberating. It's liberating.
Hmm.
And not just like I said, and
Yeah.
like you said, not just in the class, beyond out there in life. Like these are principles
Yeah.
for life, right? Yeah.
So I told you, that I had to teach that class. So I forgot to tell you something, which is that, I taught that first class and I had never done yin.
Mm.
So then immediately after, I was like, okay, I have to go take yin now because I need to know what the heck I just did. So I went and took a class from Julie Barron, who was a great Buddhist teacher, but like the first class I took was very traditional. So she was like swan, which is like pigeon, 5 minutes. And I was like, what the? I was like, what do we do now? Because I was just like, Ashtanga and Vinyasa, right? Like, I was just like, this is crazy. Like, but I couldn't leave because I was like auditioning this teacher. So I was like, oh shit, like, this is gonna be so hard. So here's what happened in that first class. Even though I had already taught for a decade, in that hour, which by the way, every time I'd look up, Baron had this super like small Buddhist smile, which I still laugh at that shit because I'm sure she was just like, so stoked that I was like about to enter this next
Mhm.
like space because she knew it wasn't about what was going to happen. So I remember thinking, God, I have not really dealt with my anxiety at all. And I thought for all that I have done for the body and for my even my attempting to try to get better, I thought I haven't really progressed that much, even after a decade of yoga. I wonder what is it like? What is happening in this moment? So because I wanted to understand that, like I said, I started doing yoga every single night. And here's the way I describe it. I describe it as I had this giant snowball of my bullshit,
Mm.
and it was so enormous. And every moment, it was just like, if I didn't deal with things, it was just gathering, velocity and mass and not like great. And I realized that at some point, if I did not start dealing with this, I would implode or explode, like really something, it was like getting really bad. And there was something about yin where yin felt like every time I did yin, I was just like ice pick, just like chipping away at a little
Mhm.
and a little more than had acquired. And so I always felt like I was making progress. And
Mhm.
then something happened. I think it was about 2 years ago. Something really drastic 1 month changed where all of a sudden I felt such extreme changes from yin. And I was like, oh, holy shit, like this works so well.
Yeah.
But over time, it is a process. And so it might take some people a couple of months or a couple of years for this huge change to happen. But honestly, I've taught thousands of students. I have never seen anything work in the way that yin does. And it's because instead of trying to like do it for people or to tell people how to do it, yin is like, you have to figure out how to do it. I'm going to give you all these tools, but you are smart enough to figure this out. Yoga at its roots believes anyone can attain enlightenment. So it already puts the power back into the practitioner's hand. And in a way, with yin, it's like it requires you to do that. You cannot not do the work. That's why some people come to yin and they're like, no, it's too much. But
Yeah.
if we want to take that journey, then you will see not only will the tissues change, but we are seeing like big change over time, which I don't have any data on, but I'm about to approach. I've got Courtney Brame and Josie Eisinger on my team, and Courtney is already OHSU. So we're going to hopefully propose some studies about yin yoga and MRI scans to hopefully be done in the next realistically year or year and a half.
I think that's fantastic. I would be, and I know my listeners would be very interested to see, what the science has to say. And
Yeah,
I love nerding out on that. And, I mean, the bottom line is this practice is for anyone who wants it. And,
yeah,
you could be, 5 years old, you could be 105 years old and practice
yeah,
yin for the first time. And that's, I think, the beautiful part about it is while it's a physical practice, and there are really physical benefits to it, that's
yeah,
not the only thing that we're doing here, right?
yeah.
um I guess I know I probably should have started here a little bit more about your origin story, but I just got like jumped in. I was
Oh,
like, ah, let's
yay.
talk yin.
I love
So
it. I love it.
we just like jumped right in. But and I know you talked a little bit about your origin story for how you came to yin, but I mean, how did you find yourself in the yoga world? Like, let's just a little bit about your origin story and how you got to be there.
Well, I've had kind of a wild life. So, I grew up on an island in Alaska, and my parents were great athletes, and my mother was like the choreographer of the dance team, like the drill team, and this is in the 80s at the high school. So I started dancing around the age of 3, and dance and all that was like kind of my world. I also played soccer and different stuff. I started studying anatomy around 16 because I was part of a science experiment where they wanted to see what would happen if they taught people who were 16 and 17 in high school college level anatomy. And
Hmm.
basically, all my friends became doctors and nurses and PTs. I was just like doing LSD and shit for a while, and then I went to neuroscience. They were like, "What's Hewitt doing?" I'm like, "Don't worry, I'll be there soon. I'm out here. I'll be."
Got my own path. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I already had studied anatomy starting fairly young. And then I became a yoga teacher by the time I was already teaching yoga. I think by the time I was 21, I ended up I was at the Hatha Yoga Center with Bob Smith and Kee McGraw, who are both still in body and incredible teachers. They still both teach. They're phenomenal. And I was also studying with them in Bali, Indonesia. And then I started, teaching right away, and I primarily taught hatha, very classic styles, for a long time. And yeah, and then I ended up, like I mentioned, co-owning a studio here. So then teaching a lot of classes. And actually, here's the thing. Co-owning the studio, I only did that for about a year. And the thing is I had 2 young children. And my 15-year-old is autistic. And I was just not sleeping, dealing with a lot of stress. So I got really into learning about stress through the work of Robert Sapolsky, who's also one of the neuroendocrinologists at Stanford. And I got really into him, and he was very influential for me. Um, for years, I couldn't sleep at night, so I would literally stay up at night and I would memorize lectures from Stanford on neurobiology because, like, that's what I did for fun. This is what nerds do for fun. Um, so yeah, I was just like learning a lot, and it was more than that. I liked the way Sapolsky taught because Sapolsky walks in with like a ripped tie-dye shirt, and you're like, did this guy just like come from a Dead concert? And he's like, hey, and you're like, that's the professor. This is like the top five smartest people in the world. Sapolsky's one of them, and yeah, he's just
Wow.
like the chillest guy. And he makes this stuff exciting and fun and funny. And the way he taught, I was like, I like this because I was like, I want people to have this information. And it changed the way I taught. I started weaving in neuroscience to teaching. I would also weave in mental health stuff. And like one of my favorite stories is like when I first started teaching yin, a bunch of people, specifically vets, were coming to me and being like, why is this the only thing helping my PTSD? And I was just like, I don't know, I'll, see you Thursday or whatever. And one day I'm teaching this like giant class. This class was so big that like they opened another room to like fit people. And I'm like, people were just going crazy over yin. And I would have psychologists, therapists writing to me. They're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't really know. It's just, and I would tell them what I knew, but I was like, I don't know. Come check it out. Let's figure it out. Like, let's try to figure it out. And one day after class, this girl comes up to me and she just goes, what are you doing? And I was like, what? And she was like, you can't talk about PTSD and yoga. And I was like, oh yeah, you like that? And she was like, this is crazy. And I was like, I know it works so well. I'm like, I'll see you next week. And then she came back next week, and she became one of my best friends, and also and teaches yoga. And what's awesome is that what she was realizing, she was like, wow, if we can find a safe way to normalize talking about things,
Mhm.
then we have a gateway into something really spectacular. Because part of what I realized was people practicing yin together was like ultra awesome, being near each other. But in my room, people didn't know that I got some people who got PTSD, and I got some people dealing with addiction. I got some people who are just got tight ass hamstrings. And I got some people that are just, I got all this different stuff going on, but all they know is that they're all practicing yin together. And so I was like, I like the idea of we can do this in a therapeutic setting, but part of what I'm really digging is us doing it together and discovering that, right, we have different, body types, but we have this way of like making it more available to everybody. So yeah, for years I was like just sort of piecing stuff together. At some points, like I remember once OHSU called me up to some meeting because they were like talking about qualitative and quantitative data. And it was like actually really important for me to see this because, sometimes I read in these studies, I'll read one line. For example, Italy did this study where they found that if people who are bipolar don't sleep for one night, they are 100% guaranteed to go into a manic or depressive episode.
Mhm.
Well, I get to read that, and that's very helpful. That's a big ass study. That took a lot of time. That took a lot of data, but it's one sentence for me to read. So I got to go into some meetings and really just see all that has to happen
Mhm.
to produce data. So I got to see some of the back end stuff. I've gone in and I get to hear, some of the lectures and when they've got new data. Like one thing that's pretty exciting, we know this from yoga, but getting to see some of the changes in prefrontal cortex and some of the things, that are changing in like amygdala, for example, which is very exciting with PTSD because, that's important for dealing with stress and stuff like that. So we're definitely understanding a lot more about it. So I was just sort of, again, right place, right time. I mostly studied the work of Dan Siegel, like interpersonal neurobiology. Also, something else I think you'll find interesting. One of the most important things I did, at one point, I just typed in neuroscience and yoga because I was like, is anybody connecting this? Because I definitely was like, people were connecting it, but I did start a little maybe earlier than some of my team. And I always tell people, I'm like, that was because I was just real stressed out. And like I went into it more from like a personal view, and then it just started, like I was at that point where it was really getting popular, a lot of stuff with mindfulness and
Mhm.
psychology. So at one point I went to Kripalu, which is big yoga school in Lenox, Massachusetts, very connected to Harvard. And I was studying neuroscience, modern yoga with Dr. Hopper, who is a Harvard psychologist, and basically goes between Sing Sing and San Quentin and
Mm.
works with people on death row. So I did a lot of like studying with him. Yeah, and I just sort of like kept studying, learning. And like at this point, I've been teaching yoga for 19 years. I teach about 80 classes a month. I do a 100-hour teacher training. I do one international retreat a year. But um, a lot of it is that when I teach, like some days, I still teach many classes. I'm more excited about yin than ever.
Yeah.
Like I'm so in love with yin. I made some joke this week. I was like, I should just tattoo yin and sleep. Because every time people ask me a question, I'm like, it's one of these two, I swear to God. Like, probably is this because
Yeah.
I keep coming back to these things. And when we learn more about sleep and when we have a practice of yin, what I'm seeing is that I can very quickly set people on a path to heal themselves. Like, that's the coolest thing ever. It works. It works really well.
No, it's amazing. One of the reasons I started this podcast was to talk a little bit about how people found their purpose. And I don't generally ask, that specific question, but we just kind of arrive there through this conversation, and I can really see that trajectory for you. I'm wondering though, like, was there ever a point where you doubted yourself or just didn't know if you were on the right path or maybe trust it? Or if not, how did you know that you were on the right path and trust that, like, yeah, the path of yoga, the path of yin is exactly where you need to be?
It's a funny thing because for me, it is so my dharma to teach yoga and to teach yin. It's just nothing that I could ever not do if I tried. And it's like
Mm.
almost hard to explain that. But like when I found yoga, it was like coming home.
Mhm.
And I could never not teach yoga. Like it's so a part of my life. I have the Om tattooed here. It's sort of like a joke because I'm married to yoga, but it's also like a very real thing because
Mhm.
the Om symbol is important. But it's like so much a part of my life. I can't even imagine life without it. Because for me, when I came to yoga, all I knew was that when I did yoga, I then didn't feel like I was so depressed I wanted to die for about
Mm.
a day, and then I would need to go do yoga again. That's all
Right.
I knew. Because when my specialties, like I start my classes a lot of times, I'll say I teach primarily yin yoga for anxiety, depression, PTSD, insomnia, eating disorder recovery, trauma, and addiction. Well, I teach all that because I had all that.
Mhm.
And because I dealt with things that were so severe. And the truth is, I think of this is so funny. There's this story. Do you know who Peaches is, the musician?
Yeah.
Okay. Peaches, who is this musician who, like in her 40s, who was like a school teacher, decides I should probably start dressing like a giant vagina and sing super random pop music and create my own genre of music because I'm an awesome person. So Peaches in an interview once, they were like, "Why did you do this?" And she said, "I didn't find what I was looking for in music. And you know what? I didn't find what I was looking for in yoga.
Mhm.
That's the truth. I loved yoga, but something was missing. And it was when I found yin, but more importantly, when I started to piece together, okay, it's yoga, but it's really this big piece of yin. But let's look at the neuroscience, let's look at the sleep, let's look at the gut and the bacteria and piecing it all together. And let's pull in the modern psychology. And like it was pulling all of it together and being like, this is what works. And beyond any theory, because theory just whatever, this is what I'm seeing is helping people. And
Mhm.
then being able to like really break down why is it helping, each condition. This is my dharma. Like there's nothing I could possibly do better with my life because for me, I was suffering, right? And the roots of these practices, I'm not just supposed to remove my own suffering, but I'm supposed to help other people. This really worked for me. So I get to now go into the world and bring this to people. And if they, want to create change, they can follow these paths and it really works. And so for me, I think it was a blessing to just like have so much crazy stuff happen in life because I think without that, I never ever would have figured out the things I figured out in neuroscience. And one thing I rarely talk about, which is so funny, I was actually just talking to my children about this. I rarely talk about this, but one of the most important parts of my life was for 22 months maybe, I was pregnant and very sick. I had a rare condition called hyperemesis gravidarum, where you throw up like 20 times a day. We kind of love Amy Schumer because she made it famous because that's great. But it's horrible. And so I went through a tremendous amount of trauma in like a medical like illness sort of way. And so it's weird, but like in my experience, I can help a lot of people because I'm never just looking through the lens of yoga or neuroscience, but I'm looking through the lens of experience.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love that. Um, and with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today about
Love
your
it.
purpose and, how you found your path and the path and all the amazing science and spiritual and mental and emotional aspects. It's been a crazy good, amazing conversation. And,
Awesome.
I wish everyone lived in Portland so that they could come experience one of your classes, although there's a heck of a wait list usually. Um, but how can people find more about you if they want to and they find out what kind of teaching you're doing? And then, like you said, you do that one international retreat a year. How can we
Yeah.
find you?
So you can check out my website. So my name is Sarasvati Hewitt. So you can check my website out. I've done multiple interviews. I had an article written through for Departures magazine recently. So yeah, I've given some different sectional like interviews for podcasts,
Mhm,
but I do have a YouTube channel. So that's a
mhm.
way people can take class and kind of see. Um, I offer workshops and my international retreat this year, I believe, is going to be in Salyulita in February. So that will be the one for 2024. And yeah, my teacher training this year is almost full. That starts in a couple of weeks, and that one's a 100-hour training. Um, yeah, and then people will sometimes invite me to speak at different, things or, come and do different stuff. So yeah, I'm primarily here and people can go and see my regular classes. But yeah, as you mentioned, a lot of them are sold out. So people have to go on and find the ones that aren't sold out at the some of the studios because Yin's getting really popular,
No,
which
and
is
don't give
great.
up hope. Even if you're on the wait list, you do sometimes win the lottery and get in, and so it does work out. You get in just
Yeah,
when you
it's
need to.
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and also remember, my amazing boss, Rachel Brooks, who owns Seeking Space as well as Yin Yoga Space. I teach at a bunch of really wonderful studios. Everyone I teach for, like, they're the best. But Brooks started a new studio, Yin Yoga Space, which is only Yin. And
Yeah.
that's really exciting. We only have a couple of those in the world, but we have one of those in Portland, Oregon. So if you want all Yin all the time, we got you.
I love that. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so
great.
much, and can't wait to
Thank you
have you
so
on
much.
again.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, I'll see you in class soon.
Yes.